Hey friends, Bart here. Just checking in with another installment on the Knox Meraki to AWS Bart project that we've been kind of working on. Now, if you didn't catch the beginning of this project, about a week and a half ago, Knox and I got together and decided that we would do a little bit of a collaboration. We wanted to do a cross-vendor project and kind of interact in two different realms that both of us are interested in. And so Cisco Meraki has been a big focus for Knox lately. He's been putting together some great material in the CBT Nuggets catalog, which is available, and more of it's coming soon as well. So make sure you check that out if you're interested in seeing what Knox has been up to. And so Knox and I got together and we were like, hey, let's work on something interesting, a project where we get to use these two different technologies that we both love. So on the Cisco Meraki devices that Knox has been administering, there is a feature called Meraki Webhooks, and it's a pretty slick little process whereby these access points and these security devices can send events to a web service or an HTTP endpoint of some sort, letting them know that something has happened to the device. A state change, an interface went down, the VPN came up, an access point has crashed, something of kind of usually of a security or a performance impact nature. And so Knox and I were thinking, wouldn't it be cool if we could get those events relayed into Amazon Web Services, capture the events, and then begin looking at what we could do with the data that we've gathered there. Because remember, these Meraki devices are just sending these events out. They're not necessarily capturing all of that locally. Kind of the important thing to remember here is that in the cloud world, there's a big focus on centralizing for the purposes of analytics. And so in this case, Knox might only have one Meraki, but you might be working with a dozen or a couple hundred devices that all want to be able to send their webhook devices events somewhere. And so this is where AWS would come into play. Now, what Knox did is he gave me some information about the webhook events themselves. They're JavaScript object notation events, which is pretty easy for me to parse. And so he's going to be sending me these events, and what I've been working on since the last video is going through building out the mechanisms that will receive the event and then process the event. So once I have all of that information ready, then we can decide what the heck we want to have it do once we get the events passing back and forth. And so to kind of catch us up here, what I've done is in the last week or so, I've spent a little while looking at sample events that have come from Meraki, because these events are really, they're my target. This is what I'm trying to capture. This is what I'm trying to consume. And so just to kind of get started, let me show you where you can find those webhook samples if you're interested in digging into this as well. And then I'll show you some of the AWS componentry that I've built kind of at a high level, and we'll take a closer look at it as necessary. So to kind of get started, if you jump out here onto Google and you take a quick look around Meraki webhook sample events, and then I would throw in Postman. Postman is a tool that the Meraki community has available for working with the webhooks. And I believe it's this one right here, Meraki webhooks and sample webhook schemas. That's what I was looking for. This essentially is going to give me a view into the events that the Meraki device is going to be sending me, and ultimately that I'm going to have to process and read information out of. So scrolling on down through, they have the Json parameters. And this was certainly a useful one for me because it helped me understand each one of the types of basically data fields that they might send and the format that it's in, so that I can begin processing it and working with it as they arrive. Farther down, if you take a look over here, webhook sample alerts, this is where stuff gets pretty exciting. This is the repository of all of the different samples that they have available. Let me go ahead and zoom out just a little bit. So here you can see an example of an access point coming up. Here's one access point going down. Let's see, another one that Knox was interested in checking out was VPN Connectivity Change. And so if we take a look at the sample over here, you can see that it is JavaScript formatted, and it's got, I don't know, what is this, 20 different fields that it's sending along. Now, I've gone ahead and I've pulled out all of these different JSON events that Knox and I thought might be a good fit. And what I found was that they're all really pretty similar. Almost, in fact, like 90% of all the events are exactly the same. They talk about the organization, the network, event IDs and things like that. And then farther down in the data itself, here you see alert data. And that's really the bulk of what makes each one of the messages unique. You get an alert type field here, and then you get this data about the event. So here we're saying that it's a VPN connectivity change. And it is this type of VPN. It was this particular ID number. Is it secondary? And then these endpoints that might be involved and what the connectivity state is. So ultimately, when I go and receive these events from Knox, I'm going to need to look for things that are more or less of interest to us. Things like the organization ID, I might not need to pull that out of every single message here. Instead, I might just be interested in what the alert was so that we can inform whatever decision it is. And we might be doing something like forwarding these along as an email. We can certainly capture and write all of this information like to S3 or to maybe CloudWatch logs. The point is that once we have it captured at AWS, then I can begin storing it for whatever analytic purposes and really kind of finishing out what I call event-driven behavior. So these events are going to come in, and once Lambda has captured all of it, then I can go and figure out what other events I want to trigger beyond having received this from the Meraki device. And so now that I understand what these events look like, I can begin architecting a solution that'll allow me to capture these. Now, within AWS, I've got a couple of different options that are available. So let's head over to the whiteboard and talk a little bit about some of the different options that are available for getting these messages from Meraki over to a Lambda function where we can begin processing it. And so over here, we've got Knox, and he's got his Meraki access points. Okay. And then on my side, I will have my AWS infrastructure running in an AWS account that I have. Now, when we go to send events to Lambda, what Meraki is going to be doing is using a basic HTTP post. That's the way that the webhooks work. So I'll give Knox an API endpoint that he can talk to. So that's kind of the first requirement here, is that I need to have some sort of publicly accessible endpoint that I can give to him, a URL, an IP address of some sort, and that will be where he'll target the events. The other part of it too then is figuring out who should provide that endpoint functionality. Now, within AWS, I can use the API gateway to provide this functionality. And the API gateway really does a lot more than just being this one particular endpoint for a post. You can do all sorts of API configuration on top of it. Another option for delivering to Lambda would also be setting up an application load balancer. The ALB load balancers have the ability to do this same sort of functionality and deliver it directly to Lambda as well. Now, for me, I've been spending quite a while working in what's called the serverless application model, or SAM. And really, it's a combination of two services at AWS. It's the API gateway and then Lambda functions as well. And so, although the load balancer certainly is a viable option, I've been doing a lot of SAM programming, so I want to kind of keep it in that venue. So that means that this endpoint that I've been talking about is going to be an API gateway endpoint that we're going to be setting up. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a few minutes. After that, the API gateway will be configured, and I've set it up as an any method. So it'll match anything like a get, a put, certainly match a post here as well. This is just for simplicity's sake, just to kind of make it easy for me. Once a method arrives at this endpoint, we have it configured to go over to some sort of a Lambda function in the background. Now, the Lambda function is the part that actually reads the body of the message and chooses a couple of pieces of event activity and what it wants to do with that event. And so now that we kind of understand the architecture, we can see that Knox is going to be delivering webhook events to the endpoint, which is going to deliver them to Lambda, and then Lambda is going to parse out the JavaScript object notation, which is in the body of the HTTP request itself. So let's spend a few minutes here. I'll just kind of cruise through, I'll show you the API gateway and the Lambda function that I use to get this working, and then we can kind of move on from there, because the next step after that is going to be having Knox finally go ahead and start sending me some of these events. So let's check out my SAM application that's going to be receiving these webhook events. Okay, so over here in Cloud9, I am just taking a look at my active project. This is the one that I wrote the Knox Meraki consumer function and application with. And I'm using Cloud9, frankly, because it's super simple. This is a serverless application that I've written here, and Cloud9 has a bunch of great hooks into the serverless application world to make it easy for me to create and deploy and manage and test serverless applications using both API gateway and Lambda functions. So it's pretty much perfectly suited for exactly what I was trying to work with. And so just to kind of show you how easy it is, I want to just walk through the serverless application wizard. So over on the right here, I can go into AWS resources, and up here at the top, you'll notice that they have this little plus sign, create a new Lambda function. When I click on that, it brings me up what they call the serverless application wizard. And this gives me an opportunity to create the functions, the APIs, and that association, which we call an application, for a serverless application. So if I did a test function here, okay, and then maybe I do a test function application for the application name, just providing some generic names to use here, okay. On the next page, it asks me what sort of environment and what sort of language framework and platform do I need to run on. Notice that you have the ability to pick between Node and Python for the serverless applications here. In my case, I was using Node. Okay, and I want to choose the project that was API Gateway Hello World. I'm choosing this project because it includes the right components that I need, both an API Gateway and a Hello World function. Remember, these are just starting pieces. Later on, I can go and plop down the actual function logic that I need it to use. So I'll choose API Gateway Hello World. We'll say next. Okay, how do I want to trigger the function? Now, this is the part that includes or excludes the gateway. In my case, I want a gateway to fire that off. So moving on down in, we figure out where is this function going to live within the API world. Now, friends, this is where the API piece kind of gets pretty deep, pretty quick. So when we talk about APIs, probably one of the easiest things to remember is think about a website address like google.com/something, okay? We think of those as URLs or as websites, but the way that we're using that address, it becomes very relevant in this API conversation. So this resource path is where in that URL do you want this function to live? And I challenge you guys too, the next time you're browsing around on some websites, take a look at the URL as you move around to different parts of the application. If it's a fairly modern app, you're gonna see that subset of paths after the domain name changing as you move through the application. You might also see parameters and things appended to the end of it. This is all related to how whatever website you're browsing, how it receives those requests and sends them on to the internal API itself. Very important part of this, especially when you get into things like representational state transfer, which is a massive topic, something that we can't dig into completely at this point. So for simplicity's sake, what I could do is just put in a slash here, and that would say that this function is going to live at the base of the URL. Okay, if I wanted to do something like test function after that, I could have it live at that particular path. And that means that when Knox goes to send me messages, he's going to need to include that additional path in his endpoint when he goes to set it up. Keeping in mind, friends, that a domain name gets you to a group of resources, but this path is more about getting you to some specific piece of functionality inside of it. It's kind of like an apartment building having a street address, and then once you get to the building, you need to look at the apartment numbers inside of the building to figure out which actual unit you want to go to. Same idea. Domain name gets you to the basic resource, and then after that, you look at the path to figure out which API or function, in our case, is going to be invoked. All right, folks, don't die on me. Stay in there. It's not that crazy. We'll get back to it a little bit more here. One final option on here is you notice that they do have security. Now, with most APIs, there is often an interest in only allowing certain parties to be able to interact with them. So you can see that they offer identity and access management, they offer none, or they offer none with a hash key as a part of it. The point is whether or not you want to require people to authenticate when they're using this API. Now, in my case, the Meraki does not have a way for me to go and embed authentication properties into their requests. So I can't have it authenticate natively. That means IAM won't work here. Putting in some sort of a challenge key that it gives to me is not going to work here as well. I'll talk a little bit more about how we validate those messages in a few minutes when we get into the function, because I do have a smidgen of security that I've added to it. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and say none. This is what I did for the function that I built for Knox's Meraki event consumer. And we'll go ahead and say next. Cool. Couple of things about the resources that you want. In my case, I'm going to stick with 128 megs. That'll work fine until I need more. I can always come back and adjust these properties later on. And then notice that there is a role that's a part of this. Anytime you're working with Lambda functions and API gateways, there are often a number of IAM roles that have to be built or leveraged in the background. Remember, API gateway needs permission to invoke the Lambda function. Stuff doesn't happen automatically within AWS. We have to give that service permission to run that particular function. And so a role is attached to the API gateway, granting it permissions to invoke that particular function. Now, it'll generate a role, or you can choose roles that already exist in your environment. Now, I built one already. It's this little Meraki consumer function. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that one for now. Cool. Cruising on through, we'll say next, and I'll go ahead and say finish. Very good. Now, what I want to show you is that in the background, notice over here in my little project, I have a test function application now. Okay, that's the serverless application. And the serverless application is defined by this template.yaml file. And so if I open up that template.yaml file, you can see some of the properties that are in it. Now they have this little wizard editor. You can also go up here to view editors and go to ACE, and that'll show you the actual YAML version of it, the text version. Cool. So this is an AWS serverless application template. And it looks and functions a lot like CloudFormation. In fact, FYI, friends, it is an augmented flavor of CloudFormation with additional serverless extensions inside of it. Ultimately, it's almost exactly like CloudFormation, just a couple of additional features on top of it. So from over here in the API Gateway dashboard, you'll notice that I have two APIs listed here. Now, there's the first one, Meraki Knox app, and then down here is the one that we just built, test function application. And notice the ID that's a part of it. That's exactly what we're looking for. Now, if I drill into this application and take a look at the resources, here is that path that you saw me set up earlier. So test function, and then here is the any method. And if you take a look over here, you see that the request comes through and ultimately ends up over here on this Lambda function. And if we click on that link, it takes us over to the Lambda function where we can begin working with the function itself. Notice that the function is set up to trigger from API Gateway. And remember, friends, all I had to do was set up that serverless application wizard in Cloud9 earlier, and it built all of these pieces for me in the background and connected them together. This was a really big helper because normally that would have been at least a couple dozen clicks for me to kind of get around and build all those pieces. And then I would still have to go through and write and develop the application. I haven't even gotten to that point yet. So thanks, serverless application, doing me a solid. All right, friends, got pretty in-depth, got pretty detailed. Let's jump over and take a look at the function, and I'll show you how to test it out. And we're going to kick this back over to Knox and see if you can generate some events for us. So back over here in my Cloud9 dashboard, if I open up the one here that says Meraki Knox app, and then we take a look at the function inside of it, here index.js or JavaScript, this is the function itself that will actually be running by Lambda out in the background. So let's take a quick cruise through here just to kind of see what it does. Starting out at the top, we're going to do a little log that just says hello, and I'm going to say loading. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and update this. Loading. So loading Knox Meraki consumer function. Great. Cool. Moving on down, this is one of the most important parts of the Lambda function. This is your handler, and its purpose is to capture the event that has been delivered to it from API Gateway. So when API Gateway sends this message over, it comes as an event, and in the body of the event is all the information that came from the request. In our case, would be coming from the Meraki devices themselves. So cruising on down in, I start declaring some variables to capture and work with some of the data. Moving on down in here, I check to see if there's a body, and then I read through it using the Json parse function here. After that, I'm going to do the first and only little bit of validation that we're looking for. Meraki does have the ability to provide what's called a shared secret. This is a little bit like that hash key that you heard me talking about earlier, except for it's a lot less sophisticated. Essentially, Knox is going to have to program in a shared secret. In my case, I am looking for 5555, 5555. We'll probably change this later on. But if Knox does not send me an event with that correct shared secret in it, this particular line is going to fail the event and bounce back a 400 error to them so that we know that it's an invalid event and I'm not going to process it because it's apparently not authorized. So this is just a really simple way of allowing remote devices to be confirmed and validated that they are allowed to send events to this particular function. So a lot happening in this function here, but really ultimately just going through, reading the body of the message, validating that it's from an approved access point by checking the secret, and then generating a message to use that data with. Now, currently, I'm not doing much other than just capturing and evaluating the events. Later on, I will set up a Lambda output destination for these events and have it written to some other data source where we can capture it and analyze it further. Once we get the basic webhook pieces working, one step at a time. All of this is very well and good. Let's test it out by using one of the payloads that Knox provided me and see how the function works. This is another place where Cloud9 can be really, really super helpful. Now, you'll notice that I made that change, and notice up here it's kind of got that little asterisk on it. So that means that there's been a change. I'll go ahead and save it. And then back over here in AWS Resources, I can open up my Meraki Knox app, and I can go ahead and deploy those changes. So that'll go through, run a CloudFormation stack update, and push out this latest copy of this Lambda function that I was using. Indeed, if you go over to the Lambda function and you take a look at the code that's running in there. Oh, I'm on the wrong one here. And I'm looking for the one here, Cloud9 Meraki Knox app. That's the function that I was using earlier. Okay, notice it says it's part of an application. Be careful. Yeah. And there you go. There's the event. That's the one that I just updated, loading Knox Meraki consumer function. So you can see it took that Cloud9 editor environment that I was using and it deployed the newest code out into Lambda. And this is, again, one of the cool things about using serverless applications in Cloud9. It is built specifically for managing API gateway and Lambda functions. So back over here in Cloud9, now that I've got that deployed and right click on that function, I can use this run option. I have a couple of different ways that I can interact with and test the function itself. Now, the one that I prefer to use is run API gateway local because it gives me the most output from it. So I'll go ahead and use that particular option. And you can see that the little run wizard now gives me the ability to model a request coming into the API gateway. So I can choose the method, the path, query strings, and of course, I can also include the body, whatever it is that I want it to include. So I've gone over and I actually pulled a copy of this out right out of the Webhook Samples that Meraki provides, pasted that on in, and then made sure that the shared secret was set correctly. So make sure that that's set properly, 5555555. Yep. Cool. So when we run this, then we can take a look at the disposition, assuming that that was a message that it had received. And so at the top, you get the response, and then on down in here, you get the headers, and then you get the actual logs that were generated as a part of the call. So here in the message, I got the valid shared secret. The alert type was an uplink status change. It was sent at this time. I got the device name. And if you look up inside here, that's exactly what I was using. There's Raptor Edge 1. Okay, uplink status change. So it's looking pretty good. It definitely processed the event. Cruising on down to the bottom, you can kind of see how some of that looks. You get the 200 back. Okay, and then here are the actual log records. So here you can see them loading the Knox Meraki function. Here's the incoming request. I got this secret. I said it was approved. And then I gathered these other data events down in here and then finally generated the response. And just to kind of show you that my logic works, if I change the shared secret and we run it again, you'll see different results. This time it should barf. Yep, there it goes. Unauthorized event. And notice the status says that it was a 400. We're looking pretty good, friends. We've got the Meraki consumer function out there. It seems to be working with the test payload, and I've got the API up and running as well. Now, remember, I was testing that through the API just now, and that means that it sent it through the API into the Lambda function as opposed to just, like testing the function locally. These are all really big benefits to using the Cloud9 developer environment when you're working with serverless applications like the one that I've been developing. So I am super excited. The last thing that I need to do is get Knox an endpoint that he can send these requests to. So let's grab that information and we'll kick it back over to Knox and see where this project goes. So back over here in the API, I'm going to take a look at the Cloud9 Meraki Knox app. That's the API that I was setting up for him. And this one has been set up at the root for any. All right. And if we take a look down here underneath of stages, this is one of the final pieces that's a little tricky here. With the serverless application, you have two different stages that are available. You have production and then you have stage. By default, it's going to deploy to prod unless you tell it not to. And so by clicking on the production link, you can see it finally produces a URL. This is the most important thing. This is money for us right here. That's the URL that I need to give to Knox and have him send these messages over. So I'm going to go ahead, grab that link address, and we're going to send it to Knox and see if he can't send me some messages. Now, one thing to kind of point out here is that I can enable logging on here, and I would like to do that. Okay, I'm going to do info data. I want to log the entire request response. All right, that looks good. And we'll say save changes. Super excited, friends. Now, I know that was a pretty long process there. If you're interested in checking out more about building serverless applications, I dig into all of these pieces in my CBT Nuggets training. And in fact, I'm going to be putting a lesson together specifically on how I did this particular part, getting the function built, getting the API set up, and making sure that we understand all of the moving pieces, because I understand there was a lot that I just threw at you. So, Mr. Datanox, we are ready for your Webhook sample events. Send them my way. Head back on over to @Datanox on YouTube when you want to see the next video in this series. And I hope you guys have a chance to kind of check it out. Knox has a bunch of great stuff. Meraki is a super fantastic platform, lots of fun stuff to cover. And of course, Cisco DevNet is a big focus for Knox as well. So I really appreciate you guys hanging out. Be sure to check back, subscribe, and stay up to date. Hit that little alert notification so you don't miss a single bit of the Meraki Knox to AWS Bart cloud project. And remember, friends, we'll see you in the cloud.